This is the latest video summary of a course that I am teaching at Glucksman Ireland House at New York University. The course is called Literature as History, and over the last number of weeks I've been looking at the life and the works of some of our great writers, James Joyce and William Butler Yeats, and connecting those with the history of Ireland during their time, a time of dramatic change in Ireland, which the writers both connected with and commented on, and I've been trying to enlighten that period in Irish history for my students by looking at the period through the life and works of Yeats and Joyce. But in today's video summary, I want to focus on two books. Now, Ulysses famously is set on the 16th of June, 1904. And in 1904 and 1905, two influential books were published in Ireland that in different ways had an effect on the public debate in Ireland about the future for Ireland and the way forward for Ireland at a time when the country was on the cusp of political change that occurred 10 years after these books were published in 1904 and 1905. The first of those books is a book called The Philosophy of Irish Ireland, published by a crusading journalist and polemicist, D.P. Moran, Dennis Patrick Moran, a Waterford-born journalist who spent some time in London and then returned to Ireland at the end of the 19th century to set up a very hard-hitting, polemical weekly magazine called The Leader, which actually continued to be published under the editorship of Moran's daughter after Moran's death, and actually only finally ceased publication in 1971. So a weekly paper that had a very long innings in Ireland, and certainly in the early part of the 20th century was quite influential in pushing this idea of a philosophy of Irish Ireland. The second book that I'll be looking at is Arthur Griffith's The Resurrection of Hungary. Now, Griffith's book is actually mentioned in the Cyclops episode of Ulysses, where John Wyse Nolan, who's based on a character called John Wyse Power, maintains that the idea behind this book was given to Arthur Griffith by Joyce's fictional character Leopold Bloom. Now, of course, that's an absurdity because a fictional character cannot give the idea for a book like this, or for the idea behind this book, to Arthur Griffith. But nonetheless, this book turned out to be a very influential political tract, not so much at the time when it was published, but later on, as I'll explain in this talk. So, I want to start with a quote from the great Irish historian from the 1960s and 70s, F.S.L. Lyons, who, in a book called Culture and Anarchy in Ireland, which he published in the late 1970s, made the following comment. He said, where Matthew Arnold, the 19th century English philosopher, saw culture as a unifying force in a fragmented society and as a barrier against anarchy. My thesis, Lyons said, is that in Ireland, culture, or rather the diversity of cultures, has been a force which has worked against the evolution of a homogeneous society, and in doing so has been an agent of anarchy rather than unity. Now, my sense is that this book was written, of course, Lyons wrote in the 1970s when the conflict in Northern Ireland was raging, and clearly he and others were concerned about the extent to which the Irish history was in some way fueling the conflict in Northern Ireland. I personally challenged that thesis. The Northern Ireland conflict in the 1960s and 70s was spurred by demands for greater equality and civil rights, rather than driven by sort of cultural animosities. But nonetheless, you can see why Lyons and people at that time were concerned about the way in which Irish history appeared to be, in their view, fueling the conflict in Northern Ireland. So Lyons, I think, was actually referring in that quote to D.P. Moran and the philosophy of Irish Ireland, because Moran became a very influential figure in early 20th century Ireland. And in my view, at least, James Joyce's lampoon in the Cyclops episode, where he caricatures and satirizes what he saw as a narrow-minded, one-eyed nationalism personified in the novel by the Citizen, based on Michael Cusack. I think the real target of that invective on Joyce's, brilliant invective on Joyce's part, may well have been D.P. Moran and the philosophy of Irish Ireland, which he epitomised in his writings. Because Moran, in an essay published in the latter part, in the last years of the 19th century, wrote about a battle of two civilizations. And Moran was a very trenchant writer who was inclined to use pretty spicy language in attacking those that he had a disregard for, or who wanted to put in their place as he saw it. Now, in previous seminars in this series, I've talked about the role of Douglas Hyde in helping to create the Gaelic League and pushing for a revival of the Irish language, and W.B. Yeats's idea of using the Gaelic past as a basis for a national literature for Ireland. Both Hyde and Yeats, while they rejected the Anglo-Ireland and the sort of influence of English culture in Ireland in the late 19th century, I think they both aspired to a sort of a hybrid culture where English, European and Gaelic elements would fuse together to create an exciting cultural offering from Ireland. Yeats said that they could create a literature which would have a global reach and which would be a new great utterance for which the world has been waiting. Now, D.P. Moran, in his articles in the Leader, and indeed in his book, The Philosophy of Irish Ireland, which is actually based on articles he wrote in the Leader, would have nothing to do with the idea of an Anglo-Ireland. For Moran, that was a complete non-starter, and he became a rather vitriolic opponent of any notion of a hybrid culture formed of English and Gaelic elements. Moran saw the Irish language as fundamental to the development of a distinctive civilization for Ireland. And Moran's prime concern was about rescuing Ireland from what he saw as the morass of Anglicisation, which in his view had dragged the country down, and he wanted to build up a civilization on Irish lines, that everything in Ireland should be distinctively Irish, and those elements that had been imported from Britain should be pushed away, and the Irish and Gaelic elements should be emphasised instead. And in one of his comments, one of his statements, he said, the Gael in Ireland is fundamental and must be the element that absorbs. So he had no time for the idea of blending English and Irish and European elements. No, for him, the Gael was the essential element in Irish identity, and that element must absorb the other influences. He was deeply hostile to Anglo-Irish literature, and he in particular took pleasure in attacking W.B. Yeats and Yeats's idea that there could be an Irish national literature in the English language. For Moran, that was a non-starter, and he was quite vitriolic in his targeting of Yeats and others who advocated the idea of an Irish national literature in the English language. Moran wasn't just hostile to Yeats and writers who wrote in the English language. He was generally a very combative individual. And he took aim at the entire Irish nationalist tradition. Whereas 19th century Irish nationalists had revered Grattan's Parliament of the late 18th century and through Home Rule were trying to restore that Parliament. For Moran, he had no interest and very hostile and said that was a Parliament for the English who happened to be born in Ireland. So he wouldn't accept that those who were involved in Grattan's Parliament in the 18th century in pushing for greater autonomy for Ireland, wouldn't accept that they were Irish at all, they were English. Wolfe Tone, who to this day is revered as the father of Irish republicanism, for Moran, Wolfe Tone wasn't an Irishman at all. He was not an Irishman, and the United Irish movement, the United Irishmen, were a colossal failure as far as Moran was concerned. He dismissed the members of the Young Ireland movement, mainly because they had invented the idea that there could be an Irish literature in the English language, which, as I've explained, was totally anathema to Moran. He was hostile to the Irish Party at Westminster, claimed that they were also not Irish because they were part of a foreign parliamentary system. So it was a very trenchant version of Irish nationalism that Moran promoted week after week. And what he said was, his fundamental view was, we can never beat England on her own terms. All we can do is to remain Irish in spite of her and work out our own destiny in the very many fields in which we are free to do so. So one of Moran's strengths was that he was in favour of economic self-sufficiency. He believed that Ireland needed to build up the wherewithal to create this distinctive civilization and to be able to match what England had to offer. Moran had seen England at close quarters and knew that it was a powerful country, that Ireland couldn't take it on, and therefore Moran was opposed to physical force nationalism, opposed to the Fenians, and he referred to the kind of rhetoric that came from both the parliamentarians and the Fenian tradition as rebel claptrap. He had no time for that. He wanted to work on building a self-sufficient Ireland, which would be economically self-sufficient, would be culturally self-sufficient through the revival of the Gaelic language. Now, his Irish Ireland philosophy was an aggressive philosophy, and Moran was sometimes blatantly sectarian. He referred to, he was very critical of what he called West Britons. He referred to Irish Protestants as sour faces. He referred to the Irish Times as the bigots' dustbin. So he was a man of fairly uncompromising views. But his philosophy, his ideas, and he was also, by the way, unapologetic about the equation between Irish nationality and Catholicism. He was a strong Catholic nationalist as well as a Gaelic nationalist. So I would say that his philosophy, his book, The Philosophy of Irish Ireland, turned out to be rather influential, and I would say that in many ways the Ireland I grew up in the 1950s and 60s was heavily influenced by the kind of ideas that Moran put forward in the Leader and in this book, The Philosophy of Irish Ireland. Now, after Griffith, now Moran, of course, had no time for Arthur Griffith. He derided Griffith's ideas for using Hungary as a model for Ireland's future. He referred to Griffith's Sinn Féin movement as the Green Hungarian Band, so he was very critical of them. But nonetheless, in many ways, Griffith and Moran had a lot in common, because Griffith was someone who also believed in economic self-sufficiency. He believed that Ireland should develop its own industrial base behind a protectionist tariff wall, and that of course became the policy of the first Irish government in the 1920s, inspired in many ways by Griffith's ideas. So Griffith was unlike Moran. He admired Grattan's Parliament, and in fact he believed that because an act had been passed in the 1780s by the British Parliament, that the British Parliament had lost the right to legislate for Ireland. So one of his aims was to restore the parliamentary tradition that had been abolished by the Act of Union in 1800. Now, of course, I think in most experts, most historians believe that Griffith got that wrong, but he did have an affection for Grattan's Parliament, and his idea was that Ireland could not overthrow British rule by physical force, because he wasn't a pacifist, but he didn't believe it was practical for Ireland to overthrow British rule through fenianism and physical force, republicanism. Also, he didn't have much time for the parliamentarians. He thought that they weren't delivering the goods for Ireland, and I suppose in the early part of the 20th century there was every reason to believe that, because the chances of home rule being achieved seemed quite low in the early years of the 20th century, because you had a conservative government in power in Britain which was totally opposed to home rule. And that changed, of course, later on when the Liberals came back into power, and then the home rule train started leaving the station again, and of course we'll be talking about that in a later session in this course. So Griffith believed that the Hungarian example, where the Hungarians in the 1860s had managed to extract a dual monarchy from the Austrian Empire, and after 1867 it was no longer the Austrian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, but the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Griffith saw this as a model for Ireland. So he believed that Irish members of the British Parliament should withdraw and form a national council, or a council of 300 in Ireland, and should engage in passive resistance. He believed that passive resistance had been the best method for achieving progress for Ireland during the 19th century. And he pointed to O'Connell's movement to achieve Catholic emancipation, to the abolition of tithes in the 1830s, to the land war in the 1870s and 1880s. So he saw passive resistance as the option. Now, in 1904, he published this book, The Resurrection of Hungary, and in 1905, this led to the establishment of the first Sinn Féin, which, by the way, was very different from the Sinn Féin movement that emerged after 1916, when it became the sort of the name that was attached to the national movement that pressed for independence in the years after 1916. As I said, it wasn't a Republican Party at all in the early years. It was a dual monarchy party, and of course it's very different from the Sinn Féin party of today. So Sinn Féin was established in 1905, but it frankly wasn't a success. I think Griffith's ideas were influential, but he wasn't a great one for organising a political movement. And by the time 1914 came around and the establishment of the Irish Volunteers, and then the Home Rule crisis of 1912 to 1914. Griffith was really a very peripheral figure. He had more or less gone back to being a sort of a polemical journalist, but with very little influence. He wasn't involved in the 1916 Rising. In fact, both Griffith and D.P. Moran, in their own ways, were opposed to the kind of thing that happened in 1916. They weren't in favour of Ireland seeking to overthrow the British government in Ireland by force of arms. Both had very different ideas, but both, I think, unwittingly contributed to the climate of opinion that led to the Easter Rising and all that flowed from that. So, ironically, 12 years after Griffith published this book, after the Easter Rising quickly became known as the Sinn Féin Rebellion, even though Sinn Féin had little or nothing, certainly Griffith had little or nothing to do with the Rising. And then in 1917, when Griffith became vice president of Sinn Féin, he took second place to Eamon de Valera. He stepped aside to allow de Valera, who was one of the commanders of the 1916 Rising, to be the president of Sinn Féin. And then Griffith went on in 1921 to be the person who helped negotiate the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and then you had a split in the Sinn Féin movement, and Griffith became the president of Dáil Éireann, and sadly died in August of 1922, just as he was about to become a major figure in the Irish Free State that his ideas had helped to bring about, although in a way Griffith was an accidental beneficiary of the events of 1916 and beyond. So these two writers are not creative writers in any way, but they had very powerful ability to put forward strongly worded opinions, and in different ways D.P. Moran and Arthur Griffith and their political tracts, The Resurrection of Hungary and The Philosophy of Irish Ireland, had a major effect on the creation of the atmosphere, the climate of opinion, which led to the independence of Ireland and the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922. So thank you for your viewing this video summary, and I'll be back again next week with a seminar on the Umaeus episode of James